everyone. Happy Thursday. Thank you, Tara, for the introduction and having me today. My name's Kelly, as Tara mentioned, and I'm an artist that's based out of Toronto. I dabble in a lot of different mediums, but I primarily work in oil paint and graphite. So the project that we're doing today is a water-soluble graphite, and I'm excited to go through this today because it's a good exercise and a project, and that's really going to focus on positive and negative space and what it means, how to use it. I'll also be talking a little bit about the products that I'm using and why. So just before we get into it, I just want to talk a little bit about negative space and positive space. I'm going to switch my camera over here so that you can see my table. Go. So you should have all the supplies that Tara mentioned. And this is the project that we're working towards today. So this was drawn with no sketch. These trees were blocked in just with negative space. So there's having negative space in art, and then there's drawing with negative space. And so what is negative space, positive space? Positive space in art refers to the subject of the artwork. So this is the area typically that the artist wants you to pay attention to. So in this piece specifically, it's the trees. And the negative space that we have is the areas surrounding the trees. So everything that was blocked in initially. So we have the sky that would be negative, and all the different shapes. So here, just under this branch, see a triangle shape there. So by focusing on the negative space when you're drawing, you're challenging your mind and challenging your skills to let go of any preconceived ideas of what that object may look like. So for artists like me, I work really tightly. So it's sometimes hard for me to loosen up when I'm doing a drawing or a painting. So this is an exercise that's really helped me, not just in drawing, also in painting. I'll get started here. I've modified this demo so that it's pretty user-friendly. So you can either work from the outline that I've drawn, or you can work from scratch with me, where we're gonna just draw with negative. So if you want to get out your sheets of paper here, I'll show you for those that do want to trace, and you have multiple sheets. If you want to trace first and then you want to go back later and experiment and try to do the negative space drawing on your own later, then that's perfectly fine. So what you're going to do with the outline is get out your tracing paper. And if you have tape, you can use it to just lock it down. But if you don't, then you can always just hold it. So you're going to place your tracing paper on top. And you're going to use one of your softer graphites. So you should have an HB, a 4B, an 8B, and a 9B. You don't want to trace with the 9B crayon because it's too thick. So you're going to get your E. And you're going to go ahead and outline all the shapes. When you're doing the leaves, you really don't have to focus on my exact outline. See how quickly I'm going over this? Because once you lay the graphite down, the brush is gonna do all the work. So this is just really mapping out where all the objects are and where all the shapes are. This was from a scene that I took a picture of when I was in Buffalo at my partner's cabin. And what I like about doing landscapes is I'll always say to try and do landscapes from your own image, from your own experiences. Maybe even take a little bit of water for your mixing from the rain or a local river, just to add something a little bit more sentimental to it. So you have some memories attached to it. One thing that's great about the water soluble graphite. So essentially what it is graphite. And then it has a water soluble binder to keep the pigment together. And since graphite is light fast, water soluble graphite is light fast as well. So you don't have to worry about your work smudging or fading over time. And it behaves just like a regular graphite. So you can lay down the color and you can choose to add water or not. Once you add water, it becomes permanent. So it works beautifully for layering, which is what we're going to do today. I'll skip forward a little bit and just show you here. So with the complete outline, you can do it one of two ways. So you'll see here that I've flipped the transfer paper over and I've gone in with my 9B. So again, you want to go in with your softest and color the back side where all your marks are. I'll do it. I prefer to do it this way just because then you're getting your image transfer exactly how it is supposed to be. You could also do it this way and not have to do the rubbing on the back. And then you could get, I'll usually use the back of a pencil crayon and I'll rub it, but the image will be opposite. So I like to do it the other way. I also find you'll get a darker transfer if you do it this way. So now for those who want to follow along with me and do from scratch, laying down the color and really kind of challenging your skills, I'll show you here just a quick, this is a really quick, rough blocking in of color. So you'll see, so just for an example, so if I'm going to start off doing this tree on the side, this one here. So for my background, I want to keep it really dark, pretty much all in one value. And it's important to play around with this. If you have a scrap piece of paper, just play around and see it is really dark. And once you add water to it, it really does travel and go a long way, and you can make it lighter in certain areas. So see, as soon as I brush that, I can pull the pigments in different directions and get a lighter transfer. Or I can go over where I went and get some darker ones. And I'll always keep a sponge near the water, or I'll use a rag. The nice thing about it is using a rag, you can just wash it after and reuse it. So anytime I'm doing watercolors or doing graphite work like this, I'll just throw it in the wash after and then it's reusable. So we're going to start with this tree on the far side here. If you'd like, you can draw a line where you want the trees, but I challenge you to just start with the background and let the trees take form as you move through the landscape. So starting with this one tree, you'll see that where I have the really dark areas in the background, where I have that negative space, I keep it really simple on the trunk of the tree. But then where there's no darkness in the background, I'll add that contrast and add that balance. That's one thing that working with positive space and negative space is really great for, is it gives your work really great balance, really great contrast. And especially when we go in and add the white pencil at the end, it'll just make those positive areas pop a little bit more. So when I'm going through here in the background, I'm just going to start off doing this background landscape here. So just doing the horizon. So I've already done the beige paper, so I'm going to work on the tan, but you can use whatever color that you'd like. Just keep in mind you see a difference with the result based on the paper that you use. And I had a really great question about this come through to my Instagram from an artist that will usually work on watercolor paper. You can absolutely do that. Watercolor paper is comes in 3 different textures: rough, hot press, and cold press. This is a really smooth surface. Typically a mixed media paper will be, it'll be smooth or vellum. So for work like this, when there's a little bit more detail, I like to use a smooth surface, because then you're not really fighting with the paper. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So you have the hot press, the cold press, and the rough. Hot press being completely smooth, the cold press, and then the rough. So you can see just from, so I've done a dry swatch and a wet swatch. So you can see from both that the hot press swatch is really, really smooth. So hot press paper or smooth or vellum is really popular with artists that are doing more realistic work. Whereas cold press and especially rough, rough is really common with abstract artists, because it'll pick up, your work will pick up the texture of the paper. So the text will become a part of your work. And you'll even see in the wet swatches here, it pick up some of that texture in the paper. And the colors as well, whether you're doing graphite or doing colored pencil, the color that you are using, the color of the paper, especially when you're using a transparent medium like watercolor or graphite water soluble, it'll show through what you're doing. So you can see here, so this is the graphite here. So a dry test and a wet test. I've done that on each color here. For watercolors, when I'm doing color, I'll typically like to use a white paper, just because that white shines through your colors and just makes it pop off the page a little bit more. So just something to consider when you're thinking about what paper you want to use, and you can see the difference on the white as well. And for this one, I actually haven't gone in with any water yet. I just left it. It's still with the water soluble graphites, but you can use it either way. You can add water or you cannot add water. So we'll get started here. So I'm going to go in with the side, and I'm not going to go to the full length that I did here, because again, it really does extend, but I'm just working in a vertical motion. And then this trunk is a little bit thicker, so you can come down a little bit. This one is a little bit thinner. And I want to give some impression that there's trees in the background without it necessarily going above the tree line and the horizon. And the reason I do that is for balance purposes. So having 4 trees, usually you'd like to have an odd number to create a strong composition. So the line that I created here, that gives the impression that there's another tree in the background and just complements that space. But you'll see these tall trees on the outside, it almost frames the center of this work. So it really directs your eye inwards. So think about that when you're doing the direction of your branches. For instance, everything in this piece brings your eye back in to the center. We're going to do a really small branch here.
Hey, Kelly.
Mm-hmm.
Santo would like you to go in more depth about the softer pencils because they're saying, can you please explain these pencils, HB, 9B, HB, etc. All my life, I only knew about HB or 2H.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the water
Great
soluble
question.
range, there are, in the pencil range, there are three different softnesses or hardness. So HB would be kind of the middle ground. It would be one that you would see most often, or a lot of, standard office pencils would be an HB or a 2B. So you can see here. So these are the different grades here. So 9B is the crayon. It's by far the darkest. And this is the darkest on the spectrum that you can get, whether it's water soluble graphite or regular graphite. And then HB, which is slightly harder, but not by much. You'll see a slight difference, but it's still pretty close in value. 4B should be lighter, and HB, which will be the hardness. So there'll be less color transfer. And you can see the difference here in the tones moving from the darkest to the lightest. So this is a good thing to experiment too with your scrap piece of paper. Just get to know the materials a little bit. Do some swatching of your own, especially working with water soluble. Just see the difference. And when I swatch a 9B, how far can I carry that pigment versus the HB? How far does that one go? There are also really good references too for when you're doing value work, just to look at how dark you can get certain areas, just to help you plan your piece.
Thanks, Kelly. The only thing I would add to that is that, you might not see them here because we're focused on the darker value pencils, but on the other side, so HB is in the middle, and like Kelly said, it's the same hardness, softness that a number 2 pencil is. As you go further down or higher in the B numbers, the graphite gets darker, pencils are softer. As you go higher in the H's, because there's a 7, 8, 9 H as well, the pencils get harder and they're really really faint. I think that most people work HB to 9B is where I, what I see.
I would say I just want to add this as well for those that work with watercolors. You will usually use a 2B when you're actually doing the sketch before the watercolor, just because you have to keep in mind with the hardness of some pencils, you'll also indent the paper. So if I'm working on whether it's a hot press, a cold press, or a rough sheet of watercolor paper, when you make an indent with a harder pencil and go over it with water, the water is going to pool into that area. So you want to work really lightly with a softer graphite. So when I'm going through the landscape here, I'm actually just going to leave some areas white, not necessarily as a full tree, but just giving the impression that something's there. Okay, so still working in vertical strokes going through the background. Now you're gonna get your brush out. So you'll notice with this brush, it's a really soft bristle. So this works really, really well with watercolor because it holds a lot of water in the belly, but you have a lot of control of the point. So the way to tell when you're shopping for brushes and working with your brushes, a good way to tell a good quality brush for watercolor or such as we're doing now is when you dip it in the water, it should hold it. And if it doesn't, it's going to be fighting your material. So I'll always tell people to do some experimenting with your materials because there's so many and it can be so overwhelming to try and find what works for you. But going for a better quality product, even if you're just starting out, I feel like it'll always lead you to a better result just because you're not fighting the product. So we're going to go in with just a wet brush and still work in horizontal strokes, sorry, vertical strokes. And you'll see I'm almost flicking my wrist as I move up because you see those details that I get when I do that with quick strokes. I'll get really thin lines, which will give the impression that there's trees there. And you can even go back in just with more horizontal strokes and maybe throw in some leaves. But you'll see the variations just in this one spot. And I only went in with the 9B crayon, but depending on the amount of water that I'm using and how far I'm carrying out that pigment, it'll get lighter in some areas. And I like that. I like doing that more at the top of the tree line because it'll be more dense towards the horizon. Okay. And the brush that we're using, so this is Princeton's Neptune brush. It's a pretty soft bristle. It's a synthetic squirrel, and all of Princeton brushes are synthetic, which tend to be more durable than a natural hair brush. Because if you think of it, with your natural hair, you have to treat it like natural hair. It requires a little bit more care, just like it would when you're, taking care of your own hair. So these are really durable. They last a long time. When you're going through here, you'll notice as it starts to dry, it becomes more matte. And I'll sometimes even leave some of the areas, some of the dry areas, just to add a little bit of interest. You'll see when I'm doing these horizontal leaves, all I'm doing is really just touching my brush to the surface, just with the side here. as I work towards these trees in the foreground, I may also just carry some of the color down separately and give the impression of a little bit of grass going around the tree trunk. I'm not adding any more water soluble. I'm just carrying down some of the pigment from what I have on the paper already. So after you've done the horizon, we're gonna go back in with some of our lighter graphites. So as we move up the tree line, we're gonna start with the tree on the left here. So I'm gonna use 4B, so our middle ground, and slowly start to build some of these areas around the tree. So some of these leaves, and help the tree kind of take form. So here. So I'm going to go on the left side of the tree here, and I'm almost going to hold my pencil parallel with the surface of the paper. And the reason for that, so you'll see just on this scrap piece of paper, if I hold it upright, then I can get finer details because I'm using the tip. So we may use this for the branches. But if you use it to the side and hold the end of the pencil, you're using your arm more than you're using your wrist. And it also keeps you loose. So you'll see, I'm not lifting it off the paper. I'm moving it back and forth across the surface. I'm kind of moving outward, and then you can do some impressions on the side to get some leaves. You can alternate your pressure too, so you can have lighter areas and darker areas. Okay. So I'm pushing my pencil outward, like to kind of create a branch, and then moving it up and down on either side of that branch, so it looks like some foliage. You'll see I'm leaving a lot of white as well. That'll help create just some highlights in the leaves and some variety. I'm getting to an area here where I want to put in a branch. So I'm going to do the same thing that we did before when we were doing the horizon. I'm just going to go around that area and block in the negative space. And I like to go, when I'm working with the water solubles, I like to go piece by piece with the brush, with the wet brush, just so I can build up an area one piece at a time. So since this is the 4B, it's kind of the in-between, you'll notice that the color travels a little bit, but not as much. So what I'm doing with this is I'm bringing some of this pigment outward, and this will kind of create a highlight. So when you're doing this step, you can start to think about where your light is coming from to help create some body within your trees. Couple things that you can do with the water soluble graphite as well is you can actually dip it directly into the water and use it that way. So after this value is dry, it's now permanent. So you can't erase it after it's dry. So you go back in and you can add some darker values. So I may go back in now with my softer graphite, my 8B, and just add some more shadow spots. And I like to focus these where there's going to be a lot of brightness. So this tree trunk, I'm not going to do much within here. I may do a couple little strokes, but for the most part, that's going to be the color of the paper. So I'll focus the darkness just so there's really high contrast right along the tree trunk here. You want to get some even darker values, what you can do is you can go in with the 90 that we were using before. So I may just pop some of that in closer to the tree line. But what you can also do with this is on a separate piece of paper, you can do a really dark swatch, go in with your brush and lift off some of that color so that you can go back in and add those darks and just have a little bit more control over where you're putting it. You can use some techniques that are similar to watercolor as well. So you can work wet on wet. You don't have to wait for it to dry to layer. So I'll show you on the back here. So if I wet an area, as soon as I add some of my color, you'll see the color does its own thing and it travels throughout and moves around that area by itself. But you can get some pretty cool effects from doing that. So try to experiment with that as well while you're building some of these areas. As I move up this tree where I may not have darkness in my negative space, I'm going to focus on the positive space and do a little bit more detail work. So what I'm going to start with is my HB. So this will be the hardest pencil that I have. So there won't be a lot of transfer in terms of color. It'll be pretty light. So I'm going to move up and I want to focus most of my shadow on the left side of the tree. So I'm going to go in doing vertical strokes, kind of just moving up and down the tree, leaving some areas white. And then as I move to the right side of the tree so that there's dimension and we give it some form, you're going to go work a little bit lighter, but you still want somewhat of a line there. Try not to draw a hard line. Try to shade from one side of the tree from the other so it looks more realistic. And you can even move down to where we've done a lot of negative space. Sometimes in the middle of the tree, I'll throw in some details. So I'll do some shading in between, but not a lot, just enough so that it's a smooth transition. Maybe do some holes in the tree or some branches in the middle. This is my HB. When I do go in with water, it'll be a lot lighter. I'm really not applying a lot of pressure. I'm just very lightly adding water to the surface. So I still want to keep some of the line work that I kept in there without rubbing it up too much. Where I have this branch sticking out here, I'm just going to go back into the center here and just add a little bit more of a shadow so it's a little bit more convincing. So with my light coming from here, it's hitting the top of that branch. So the shadow would be diagonal on this tree, almost reaching the other side. So see how it's really starting to take form here. And this is dry, this area here that I did with the HB, it's dry. So I'm gonna go back in with the HB again and just layer a little bit more. I don't want it to be too dark because I don't want it to compete with the foliage. And I still wanna give the impression that it's a birch tree and keep it light. So I'm gonna add a little bit more value just on the left side of the tree. And then you're going to continue up until you get to the next spot where you're going to do the negative space and more foliage. I'm going to go in with my 4B again, so my middle grade. And again, holding it to the side so that it's a looser stroke. It's using the full side of the pencil. So you'll get a little bit more graphite transfer, but also you'll get some really cool texture that gives you just quick details. If at any point you want to see something a little bit closer, just write in the chat and I can hold it closer to the camera. I know it's tough with the virtual stuff. So I'm going down the trunk here, and because it's next to all my negative space and my really darks, I'm going in just really lightly, just to add some interest, but I'm focusing all that on the center of the tree trunk. The mixed media paper is really great for wet and dry techniques, but you don't want to use too much water with mixed media just because it's, even though it's treated the same way as watercolor paper is specifically made for wet medium. So it'll be able to take a lot more water and absorb a lot more water and pigment than a mixed media paper will. But for this, we're really not using that much water. We're really just going in with a damp brush. So every time you do go into your water, just lightly pat it on either the rag or a sponge or paper towel, whatever you're using. So I'm going to move on to my second tree here. So this one, you'll see there's really not a lot of negative space up until I get to the top where I have these white branches here. So this part here, I'm going to go in with my, I'll go in with my 4B, so my middle tone, because I want it to be darker. So we have the base of the trunk here, and then as soon as it hits that tree, the top of the tree line, I'm going to start by working up. And this one's really thin because it's in the distance. So
Right, I'm unmuted. Hey Kelly, apologies if you address this because I'm catching up a little bit. Have you shown them how, like, if they went over their tree or they need to remove some of the pigment, how they can do that?
So you can remove it a little bit while it's still wet, but when you do go to lift the color, if it's dry, it won't lift like a watercolor will, just because it's permanent. So I'll wet an area just to show you how to do it here. So if I have a spot here when I want to lift the pigment. So it's still wet. So what you could do, go in with a clean brush that's not that wet and just lift off the paper. You can also blot. So I'm pretty much lifting with a dry brush. I really don't have a lot of water on my brush. And I'm just lifting the pigment off the surface. You can also blot if you have a clean rag. You can just lift some of it. And this is a really popular technique if you're doing watercolor, if you're doing what we're doing, the water soluble graphite, because you can get some really nice textures in there too. And the rag that I'm using, it's a towel, so it has all those thicker fibers, so it'll give kind of a bush impression without me doing any extra work. It'll give me those textures just on its own. If it's already dry, oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead. I was literally saying the same words as you. I was going to be like, well, if it's dry.
Okay. So if it is dry, unfortunately, you can't lift. But what you could do is when we do go back in with our white pencil, you could always just really lightly brush those faces. So this part here is completely dry, but say I wanted to add a little bit more value. So I'd really just brush some of the white on there just to lighten that area a little bit.
So Kelly, once the graphite is sort of married with the paper, you can't use an eraser to pick it up.
No, so after it's not like regular graphite in that sense. So when it's dry, you can still lift it, but as soon as you add water, it becomes permanent.
Right.
So that's where it also differs from watercolor. Watercolor, when it's dry, you can lift it a lot easier, but you can't lift it after it's dry with water soluble graphite.
Okay, and could you do a little close up on your leaf detail? Emily, oh no, I'm sorry. Suzanne was wondering if you could go over that again real quick.
Yeah, for sure. So how I did this spot here, so I went in with my 4B, but you can use, if you want to start with an HB, you can do that as well. It'll just be lighter, so you'll be able to build on it more. But I always start with a lighter one, and then I can always add the darks in because you can't lift the darks off. So when I'm doing the leaves, so this example here, I haven't added any water to that, so I'll hold it up. So you can see that I get a lot of great textures in there just from how I'm holding the pencil. So you're going to hold it towards the end. What I like to do is when I'm working with pencil, if I want more control, I'll hold it closer to the edge. But if I want to go a little looser, then I'll hold it towards the back. So I'm going to work pretty much, I'm almost parallel with my table. And I'm pushing the pencil out and pushing into the paper. And really just working around a spot, leaving some white areas just to create more dimension and more interest. But I'm not lifting it off the paper. I'm just moving it around. And then when you do this with your lighter graphite, so you can add water to it. If you're happy with a little bit more texture, then you can always leave it, or you can leave some areas. So I'll go back in now with a wet brush. Just move around some of the pigment. And I can go back into it with a darker grade, a softer grade, so an 8B, while it's still wet, and it'll blend a little bit more, so it'll be a softer transfer. So I'm gonna add some darks in there. Or if you want more of if you want sharp details, then you would wait until it's dry. The same thing, pencil's pretty much parallel with the table, and I'm just moving it around, not lifting it off the paper. You're almost doing little X's. So you'll see my second tree here, I'm holding it closer to the tip because I want more detail and a finer line.
Do we have an image of the finished drawing I could put in the chat?
Yes. Here, am I able to send this to you? What would
Oh
be
yeah, I just asked Lauren, if send it to events, if that's okay. And I can put that in the chat. But Lauren was just checking to see if we had it.
okay?
But if you want, that'll be easier if you just want to take a picture and send it.
And it's events at plazaart.com.
Perfect.
Okay, I just sent that. So as I move on along this tree, I'm going to do some thin branches. And don't get too fussy over having really straight lines. There's no straight lines in nature, so don't worry if your tree trunk isn't straight. Makes it more interesting and more realistic.
Kelly Santo's asking for some clarification as he's new to painting. The lighter, but he's saying, so the lighter values should be used for foreground and darker values for middle ground and foreground. Sorry.
Not technically. So the way that we're working, we do have our darkest area in the back here. So I'll just show from this piece, the final piece. With my water so it doesn't spill over the artwork. So we worked from the foreground, which is our darkest value, and we still have some really dark values here. So even though they are in the background, we have some similar values. So this tree that's in the back, you'll see in some of the leaves here, they are lighter. And that is actually a similar value to what I have here in this tree. So using darkest as your background, lightest as your foreground doesn't necessarily, it isn't necessarily right. It would just be the level of detail. So as things move into the background, you're going to see less detail. So here, where this value is pretty much the same, you'll see that I've left it a lot more of the dry pigment there. So I can see more of the textures, where here I've used more water and diluted that a lot more so that you don't see as much of the leaves, because you wouldn't in nature. When you're looking in the distance, your details get distorted. Hope that helped to answer the question.
No, that was great. And I have shared your image in the chat for anybody that needs it.
Oh, so along this tree here on the right-hand side, I have a branch that comes off with a lot of foliage here. So I'm going to go do the exact same thing, but I'm not going to obsess over the shape of this one as much, just because this tree is further in the distance. So like I said, you don't need to get a lot of detail in here, because it would kind of disappear as it moves into the distance. So I'm just blocking in color really lightly. And most of the work that I'm going to do is going to be with the brush as I move the pigment around. So going with my wet brush here. I like the effects that you get when you do this, when you are just dotting the sheet, because it'll keep some of that dry texture from the graphite, but also wet some areas. So for foliage that's in the distance, it's really nice because you get a little bit of details, but not a lot. And I'm just going to go, while this is wet, I'm going to go back in with the HB. I want to go back in while it's wet, just because I want it to be a little bit more of a seamless blend. But I just want to add some value here, just to give this some dimension and some body. So you'll see I focused a lot of those darker values on the underside of this area, just to give it some more shape. So a lot of my lighter values are at the top here, where the sunlight would hit. I'll do a lot of plein air work, just going out, and it's easy going and doing it with water soluble, because you're not bringing all your paints. There's not a lot of materials. It's really great for travel too. If you have a little like mixed media sketchbook, you're not bringing a lot of materials with you, and it's a nice little memoir for when you travel somewhere. You do a really quick sketch, and then you don't even have to bring the brush with you. You can go back to your studio and add it then and make it an even more complete piece. But it's nice even as to do value sketches. If you're a painter, a lot of painters will do a value sketch of an area, which basically means they take down the different values in an image. So kind of like what we're doing here, where we're doing our darkest values to our lightest values. And they'll do that on scene and go back to their studio and then turn that into a painting. So it's not really necessary to take a picture. They already have those values to refer to complete a painting. So this tree gets a little bit more interesting because it has this area here where the branches are white, and then you use your darkest value in between there. So what I'm doing now, I'm going in just.
And if you're wondering what oil painting masters is, let me explain it to you.
I think someone's audio. So I'm going in and just doing dry before I go in with my water, just because I want to get the shapes down here. So I'm going to go to the top of the tree trunk where I made my darkest value. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in with my HB. And I'm going to build around and apply quite a bit of pressure because I want this to be pretty dark. So as I move to the outside of this dark area, I'm doing some rough sketching, just so I have some shape in there, so some impression that it's foliage. And then I'll go in beside the tree trunk here and just create some more little branches. Okay. See there how dark that is compared to the value that I did before. And then I'm going to go back and continue with my lighter value above this area. And I'm actually going to bring this right to the edge of this first tree, because at this point of the tree, it's pretty light. So we want to make this come forward by putting negative space around it and focusing our dark value right along that tree trunk. And then as you move back towards this tree, you can go a little bit lighter. Because I have some pretty fine branches up here, I'm just going to go in and just sharpen my HB, so my hardest pencil. And when you're sharpening it, you really don't have to press very hard because you don't want to break the pencil. You just want to really lightly I'm going back in with my water now. And I like to just dot in some loose leaves here just because I feel like it helps create some movement. Makes the tree look as if it's in the wind. When you're using your water here and moving around some of the graphite, try and use the tip of your brush a little bit more towards the edges, just because remember that this tree is going to be in the distance. So these leaves are going to be a lot smaller. I'm going to go back in with my HB and just add some darker values, but I'm going to still stay away from this area where I want it to be my darkest value. So anything around here, I'm going to keep pretty light. I'm going to leave that untouched. Okay. I'm going to add some darker values here. And this will help give this area here a little bit more form because I have a really dark area here. If I keep this light and add some dark underneath, it'll section off that part and give it a little bit more body. See, already you see that as a separate piece. And that's what you want. And you'll start to notice too, once you apply the water, you'll naturally see some spaces that have sectioned off themselves. So try and take advantage of that. So you'll see in this area here where I added the water to the graphite, there's already some light areas and some dark areas. So I may play with that a little bit and build that up even more. So I'm going to go darker here. And then it kind of, it's naturally darker here. So I'm going to make that even darker. I'm not gonna add a ton of water to this part when I did add those darks because I kind of like it as is, and I like the texture that it's giving off. So I'm just gonna wet some areas just to blend it a little bit more, but in areas here, I like the sharpness of those darks there, so I'm gonna keep that. And you'll notice with this trunk, I didn't apply any water. You can if you'd like, but I like that sharpness because that is such a small area and such a fine area. You'll see what I mentioned before, how these trees frame this image. So working toward this tree into the picture, you'll see that line brings you right into the image, right into your composition. So this tree here should be smaller than your last branch on the other tree. And because this tree is even further in the distance, you want to work with even smaller strokes. So you'll see when I'm moving my pencil back and forth, I'm still using the same technique. It's still parallel with my table, but I'm not going very far with it. It's really small horizontal strokes. There are different types of watercolor brushes that you can use for this kind of technique. I really like using this one because it's softer and it does hold a lot of water, but you can, it's all preference. So you can experiment and use brushes. A popular one would be a Kolinsky Sable. It has a little bit more snap to it. So it keeps a little bit more of a finer point. So while I've done these three trees, I'm just going to go back and just to show you how to use the dry pastel, because I want to bring out some of these highlights. So since my light is coming from the top right hand side, I'm going to focus my white in those areas. And I'm going to scratch it in, still keep some areas white, but see how it just made that area pop. So I'm just going to use, I'm not going to overdo it with the white, but I'm going to pop it in areas and really focus it on just that one side, just so the tree comes forward, and any branches. So this branch here, I want this to come forward a little bit more. So I'm going to use it right on the edge. See that? It looks like it's coming off the page there. You can also smudge the dry pastel. I'll sometimes roll up a piece of paper. So I'll take a little scrap, roll it like so. So it's like a cone. And then I will put my finger in and I will just blend it across the surface just to soften some of the lines. I kind of like the hard lines, but if you did want a softer look, then you could always do that. I'm going to use a lot of this white pastel here because I didn't do any details of this tree in the.
I was just gonna see when you were gonna take a break, because I've got the dog.
And then this one in the distance, I'm going to add a little bit of white, but not too much, because these trees in the foreground, these two ones here, this is where I'm going to focus a lot of the white, because those ones are closest to me. For the last tree, it's really all in positive space. So it's just the area across the bottom that's in the negative. So it's going to be a lot of detail working up the tree. So all you're going to do is do the same thing we did with this tree on the far left. And shade some areas using vertical strokes. And just working your way up the tree. Focus a lot of your shading on the left side of the tree. And I'm almost leaving some really long circular areas blank. You see that there. So I'm using my HB, so my lightest, but that's just because I'm gonna layer. So I'll go through here. And I'm not creating a hard line on the other side. I'm still shading, but just a lot lighter. I'll bring some of that shading down, but not a lot, because I want to focus on the negative space there.
Catherine, it's a HB pencil that Kelly is using, I believe. Kelly, is
So I'll
there
start with
oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so I'll start with the HB, and then I'm adding water because that's my lightest value. It's always safer to start with your lightest value, and then you can go back in and add your darks. So I'm going to go in there, and I still want to keep this tree relatively light because it is a birch tree.
And when you have any chance, if you have any tips, looks like Michelle's having trouble getting the white pencil to work on top of the graphite.
It might be the pressure that you're applying, so just try to add a little bit more pressure. You can always shave some of the pastel down on a separate sheet of paper, and it should be a little bit easier. It'll just work the pencil a little bit. But this really shouldn't be going over top of your really darks. It should be going over top of your highlighted areas. So on this tree here, I'm just touching the white with in the areas where a lot of the paper is and my mid value. Now this tree's still a little bit wet, so I'm going to hold off with the pastel because I want it to stay a dry effect. I don't want it to blend. And all I did for the foliage on this tree was just do a simple line. So this is called a continuous line, so line drawing. So all I do is I'm not lifting my pencil and I'm just kind of squiggling, almost creating kind of like a cloud shape. And the reason I'm doing that is because, like I was talking about earlier, balance is really important in your composition. So if I were to do something really heavy on this side, it would pull my eye to the top, where I want this piece to stay really grounded. So I have a lot of darks here already. I don't want it to be too top heavy. So I'm going to do just a really simple line on that one side. And I'll do another branch down here that will do the same thing. So just the impression that there's something there. And I'll go in with my whites here. And this area I'll blend a little bit with my finger, or if you prefer not to use your finger, you can use a blending tool, like a do-it-yourself blending tool like this. Just because I want it to be a little bit softer. But on the tree, I won't do much blending. I want to keep a lot of that texture from the pastel. And you'll see in some areas here in the darker value, I'm pressing really hard and I'm just lifting it off, doing a quick stroke. And it just gives the impression that there's maybe a little bit of a bump there that's picking up the highlight. You can also go in with your darker graphite. So I'm going in with I'll go in with the 8B. And I'll do some darker branches, but I'll also add maybe some darker values here. And I'm not going to go back in here with water. I'm just going to do some line work just to create a little bit more interest. Maybe throw in some dots for some texture. And then you're all done. I'm just going to go ahead and sign the bottom here. And that's your finished piece. And because it's graphite, like I said, it's light fast, so which means it won't fade over time. So you can frame it, put it on the wall.
That was awesome, Kelly. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't wait to have you back. Should we all share? Can we go up into the gallery view and turn your cameras on so we can see? Ooh, beautiful, Deb. All right, let me see some more. Oh, Pat,
Oh,
fantastic.
beautiful.
Donna, love it. Nancy, oh my God, great detail. Beautiful work. I'm
Wow,
always
really nice.
impressed with our crowd. You guys have done it again. Really, really nice stuff. I hope you all enjoyed it today. We really enjoyed having you. We hope to see you back for the next one. Thank you so much, and really have a happy Halloween if you celebrate, and enjoy the rest of your week and your weekend. All right, take care. See you all soon. Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you so much. Take
All right,
care,
take care.
everyone.
Bye-bye.